Hey guys, tonight we are going somewhere hot. Really hot. The kind of hot where your sandals stick to the ground and your brain starts asking philosophical questions like, why did humans ever leave the ocean, and is sweating supposed to smell like this? We are heading to ancient Persia, specifically to the central plateau of what is now Iran, somewhere around 2500 years ago, give or take a few centuries depending on which historian you ask at the party. And yes, historians do go to parties. They just spend the whole time arguing about dates. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes, and the first thing you notice is the light. It is not like any light you are used to. It is white, aggressive, the kind of sunlight that feels personal, like it has a grudge against you specifically. You are standing on cracked earth, somewhere in the middle of a vast plateau surrounded by distant brown mountains. The air is dry enough that you can feel it pulling moisture from your skin the moment you take a breath. Your lips are already chapped. You have been here for approximately 45 seconds. Welcome to the Persian Plateau, one of the most unforgiving climates humans have ever decided to call home. The summer temperatures here regularly climb past 40 degrees Celsius, which is about 104 Fahrenheit for those of you who still measure things in freedom units. In some parts of the central desert, temperatures have been recorded at over 50 degrees. That is hotter than the inside of a car with the windows rolled up. That is hotter than a pizza oven on its day off. That is the kind of hot where metal burns your hand and shade becomes a form of currency. And yet, as you squint into the distance, you can see something impossible. There is a city out there. Not a ruin. Not a mirage. A living, functioning city with people walking around, going about their business, not melting into puddles of regret. How is this possible? How did anyone survive here before electricity, before refrigerators, before the invention of complaining loudly about the weather on social media? You start walking toward the city, and as you get closer, you notice something strange on the skyline. Rising above the mud brick buildings are dozens of tall, rectangular towers. They look almost like chimneys, but they are not releasing smoke. If anything, they seem to be breathing. You watch as the hot desert wind hits one of the towers, and you could swear you see the air shimmering differently around it, like something is happening inside. Something clever. These are badgers, the famous wind catchers of Persia, and they are about to become your new favorite piece of ancient technology. But we will get to those in detail later. For now, just know that what you are looking at is one of the most elegant engineering solutions in human history. A way to cool a building using nothing but the wind, the sun, and a very good understanding of how air behaves when you trick it into doing what you want. You keep walking, and now you are close enough to see the streets. They are narrow, much narrower than you expected. The buildings on either side lean toward each other, almost touching at the top, creating long corridors of shade. This is not an accident. This is not lazy urban planning. This is intentional. The Persians figured out thousands of years ago that if you make your streets narrow enough, the buildings will shade each other for most of the day. The ground stays cooler. The walls stay cooler. The air trapped between them stays cooler. It is such a simple idea that you wonder why modern cities forgot it. Probably because someone invented the car and decided we needed wide roads more than we needed comfortable temperatures. As you wander through the shaded alleyways, you start to notice the walls themselves. They are thick, really thick. Some of them are over 1 meter wide, made of a special mud brick mixture that the Persians perfected over generations. This material, often called kesht, has remarkable thermal properties. It absorbs heat during the day very slowly and then releases it at night even more slowly. The result is that the interior of a Persian home stays relatively stable in temperature, never getting as hot as the outside during the day and never getting as cold as the outside during the night. It is passive climate control built into the very bones of the building. Scholars still debate exactly when the Persians first developed these sophisticated building techniques. Some evidence suggests that advanced thermal architecture existed in the region as far back as 4,000 years ago, during the Bronze Age. Other historians argue that the most refined versions of these technologies did not appear until the Achaemenid Empire around 500 BCE. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, with gradual improvements happening over millennia as people experimented, failed, learned, and tried again. That is how most human progress works, after all. Slowly, painfully, one sunburned generation at a time. You duck into a doorway to escape the afternoon sun, and immediately you feel the difference. It must be at least 10 degrees cooler inside. Maybe 15. The air is still dry, but it does not feel hostile anymore. It feels almost pleasant. You look around and realize you are in someone's home. There is a central courtyard open to the sky, with a small pool of water in the middle. The pool is shallow, maybe only a few centimeters deep, and perfectly still. Around it, potted plants create patches of green in the otherwise brown and white space. This is the classic Persian courtyard house, a design that has been copied and adapted across the Middle East, North Africa, and even into Spain and Portugal. The courtyard serves multiple purposes. The open roof allows hot air to rise and escape. The shallow pool evaporates slowly, cooling the air around it through a process that scientists today call evaporative cooling, but that the Persians just called common sense. The plants add humidity and create pleasant microbreezes as air moves over their leaves. Everything works together as a system, each element supporting the others. You sit down on a stone bench beside the pool and let yourself relax for a moment. Your body is already adjusting. Your heart rate is slowing. Your breathing is deepening. This is what the Persians understood that we have largely forgotten. Cooling is not just about temperature. It is about the whole experience. The sound of water trickling, the sight of green leaves, the smell of wet earth, the feeling of stone that has been cool for 1,000 years. These things matter. They tell your nervous system that you are safe, that the emergency is over, that you can stop sweating quite so aggressively now. A child runs through the courtyard, laughing about something, and disappears through another doorway. Life continues here, as it has for centuries. People are born, grow up, fall in love, argue about politics, make bad decisions about pottery, and eventually die, all in the shade of these ancient buildings, all cooled by technologies that require no fuel, no maintenance contracts, no software updates. There is something deeply reassuring about that. But the courtyard and the thick walls are only part of the story. The real magic, the thing that made Persian civilization possible in this impossible climate, lies underground. Somewhere beneath your feet, right now, water is flowing. Cool, clean water from the mountains, traveling through tunnels that stretch for kilometers, arriving in this city without a single pump, without any external power source, without any of the infrastructure that modern people assume is necessary for urban life. These underground channels are called qanats, and they are arguably the most important invention in Persian history. More important than poetry. More important than carpets. More important than that really good rice dish with the crispy bottom that everyone fights over at family dinners. Without qanats, there would be no Persian Empire. There would be no Silk Road trade cities. There would be no gardens, no fountains, no sharbat cellars on hot afternoons. There would just be empty desert, baking in the sun, waiting for someone clever enough to figure out how to make water flow uphill. Or, more accurately, how to make it flow slightly downhill for a very, very long distance. You will learn all about qanats soon enough. You will crawl through them, metaphorically speaking. You will meet the muqanis, the hereditary tunnel diggers who maintained them. You will understand why some historians call the qanat the single greatest feat of hydraulic engineering in the ancient world. But that is for later sections. For now, just know that the water in that little pool in front of you came from a glacier high in the Alborz Mountains, traveling underground for perhaps 50 kilometers, arriving here as cold and fresh as the day it melted from the ice. The sun is starting to set outside. You can see it through the open roof of the courtyard, the white light turning gold, then orange, then a deep, bruised purple. The temperature is already dropping. The thick walls, which absorbed heat all day, are now starting to release it, but slowly, gently, like a hug from someone who runs warm. In an hour or two, people will start coming up to the rooftops to sleep under the stars. This is another Persian innovation, though it seems so obvious that you wonder if it counts as an innovation at all. Why stay inside a building at night when the outside is finally pleasant? Why not just move your bed to the roof? You lean back against the stone wall and close your eyes. The sound of the water is soft and constant. Somewhere in the distance, you can hear the evening call to prayer, though if you have traveled far enough back in time, it might be something older, a Zoroastrian ritual, or perhaps just the sound of families gathering for dinner. The specifics do not matter. What matters is the feeling, the sense of being part of a continuous human story, a story about how people learn to live in places where they probably should not have been able to live at all. But for now, you rest. The desert is releasing its heat into the night sky, and the city is breathing around you, alive and ancient and impossibly cool. Morning comes slowly to the Persian plateau, which is fortunate because you are not entirely ready for it. The rooftop where you slept was comfortable enough, a thin mattress on a wooden frame, a light blanket that you kicked off sometime around midnight when the temperature finally dropped to something resembling reasonable. You wake to the sound of pigeons cooing somewhere nearby and the distant clatter of a cart being pulled through the narrow streets below. You sit up and look around. From this vantage point, you can see the entire city spread out before you, and what strikes you most is not the buildings themselves but what rises above them. Dozens of towers, some square, some octagonal, some with ornate brick patterns and some plain and utilitarian, all of them reaching toward the sky like fingers trying to catch something invisible. These are the badgers, the wind catchers, and in the soft light of early morning, they look almost like a forest of stone trees growing from the rooftops. The city you are looking at is Yazd, or at least it will be called Yazd eventually. Right now, it might go by a different name depending on exactly when you have arrived, but the important thing is that this place has been continuously inhabited for over 5,000 years, making it one of the oldest cities on Earth. People have been living here, in this furnace of a landscape, since before the pyramids were built. Since before Stonehenge. Since before anyone figured out that writing things down might be a good idea. And for most of that time, they have been perfecting the art of staying cool. You climb down from the roof using a narrow staircase built into the side of the building and step out into the street. The air is still cool from the night, but you can already feel the sun warming your shoulders, a reminder that you have perhaps 2 hours of comfort before the day turns hostile again. You decide to use that time wisely. You are going to find a badger and figure out how it works. The first wind catcher you approach is attached to a large building that looks like it might be some kind of public hall, or perhaps a wealthy family's home. The tower rises about 15 meters above the street, built from the same mud brick as everything else, but with geometric patterns pressed into its surface. At the top, you can see 4 large openings, one on each side, facing the 4 cardinal directions. This is a Chahataki design, meaning it has 4 openings, and it is the most common type of badger in this region. You find a doorway and step inside. The interior of the building is dim and cool, noticeably cooler than the street outside, and as your eyes adjust, you realize you can see the base of the wind catcher rising up through the center of the main room. It is like standing at the bottom of a very tall, very narrow chimney, except instead of smoke going up, air is coming down. You can feel it on your face, a steady, gentle breeze that seems to appear from nowhere. Here is what is happening, explained in the simplest possible terms. The wind catcher works on two basic principles that the Persians understood intuitively long before anyone gave them scientific names. The first is that hot air rises. The second is that wind creates pressure differences. When the wind blows against one side of the tower, it creates positive pressure in that opening, pushing air down into the building. At the same time, the openings on the other sides of the tower experience negative pressure, which pulls air up and out. The result is a constant circulation of air through the building, even when the wind outside is barely noticeable. But that is only part of the story. The really clever bit happens at the bottom of the tower, where the shaft meets the building. In many badgirs, this junction point is built over a pool of water or positioned near a qanat channel. As the air rushes down the shaft, it passes over or near this water source. The water evaporates slightly, and that evaporation absorbs heat from the air. By the time the air reaches the living spaces, it has been cooled by several degrees. It is essentially a passive air conditioning system, one that has been running continuously for over 1,000 years without a single electricity bill. Scholars have measured the temperature difference between the outside air and the air coming out of a well-designed badger, and the results are impressive. On a day when the outside temperature is 42 degrees Celsius, the air inside a badger-cooled building can be as low as 29 degrees. That is a 13-degree difference, achieved with nothing more than clever architecture and basic physics. Modern air conditioning units struggle to maintain that kind of differential, and they require enormous amounts of energy to do it. You stand there for a while, just enjoying the breeze, watching the dust motes drift through the shafts of light that filter in through small windows high on the walls. A cat wanders in, looks at you with the casual disdain that cats have perfected over millennia, and curls up in a cool corner. Life in this building moves at a different pace. There is no rush. There is no urgency. The heat outside is a problem that has been solved, and solved elegantly, and now everyone can get on with the more important business of drinking tea and gossiping about the neighbors. The owner of the building appears eventually, an older man with a neatly trimmed beard and curious eyes. Through a combination of gestures and the few words of Persian you have somehow acquired, you manage to communicate that you are interested in his wind catcher. He seems delighted by this. Most people, he implies, take these things for granted. They grew up with them. They do not think about how remarkable they are. But he remembers his grandfather explaining the principles, showing him how to clear the channels when they got blocked with dust, teaching him the songs that the builders supposedly sang while constructing the first towers. Some of those songs, he tells you, are very old, older than anyone can remember. They contain instructions hidden in the lyrics, measurements encoded in the rhythm, angles and proportions passed down through generations of builders who could not read or write, but who could remember a song perfectly. Historians still debate whether this is actually true or just a romantic story that has grown up around the badgers over the centuries. But either way, it speaks to how important these structures were to the people who built them. They were not just functional objects. They were cultural treasures, worthy of poetry and legend. You thank the man and step back out into the street, which is now noticeably warmer than it was an hour ago. The sun has climbed higher and the shade is retreating. You need to find somewhere to wait out the worst of the midday heat, but first you want to see more of these towers. You want to understand the variations, the different designs, the ways that builders adapted the basic principle to different situations. Walking through the city, you start to notice that not all badgers are the same. Some have only one opening, facing the direction of the prevailing wind. These are called yektaraki, and they are simpler but less effective when the wind shifts. Others have 6 or 8 openings, designed to catch wind from any direction. Some are short and squat, built for smaller buildings. Others are impossibly tall, rising 20 or even 30 meters, capturing winds that blow high above the city streets. You also notice that the interiors of the towers vary considerably. Some have simple, open shafts. Others have complex internal partitions, wooden or brick structures that divide the shaft into separate channels. These partitions serve multiple purposes. They increase the surface area of the interior walls, which helps to cool the air through contact with the cool brick. They also create separate pathways for incoming and outgoing air, improving the efficiency of the circulation. The most sophisticated badgers are essentially passive air handling systems, with intake vents, cooling chambers, and exhaust channels all integrated into a single structure. One thing that strikes you is how quiet everything is. Modern air conditioning systems hum and rattle and click. They announce their presence constantly, a background noise that we have learned to ignore but that never quite goes away. The badgers are silent. The air moves through them without complaint. The only sound is the occasional whisper of wind across the openings at the top, a soft sighing that the locals say is the tower breathing. It is a sound you could fall asleep to, and indeed, many people have, for many centuries. You find a tea house with a particularly impressive badger and decide to stop for a while. The owner brings you a small glass of tea, dark and sweet, along with a handful of dates. You sit in the cool breeze and watch the light change as the morning becomes afternoon. Outside, the streets have emptied. Anyone with any sense is indoors now, waiting for the sun to pass its peak. This is the rhythm of life in the desert, a daily negotiation with the heat, a pattern that has been repeated since the first humans arrived on this plateau and decided, against all evidence, that this would be a good place to settle down. The tea house owner sits down across from you, clearly happy to have someone to talk to during the slow afternoon hours. He tells you about his badger, which was built by his great-great-grandfather and has been cooling this building for over 200 years. He has had to repair it twice, once when an earthquake cracked the shaft, and once when a family of owls decided to nest in the upper chamber and block the airflow. But mostly, it just works. Year after year, decade after decade, cooling his tea house and everyone who sits in it, asking nothing in return except occasional maintenance and the respect of not being torn down for something more modern. You nod and sip your tea and think about all the air conditioning units in the world right now, humming and clicking, consuming electricity, warming the outside air even as they cool the inside. You think about how much energy that represents, how much carbon, how much environmental cost. And here is this tower doing the same job, built from mud and wisdom, powered by nothing but the wind. The afternoon stretches on. The light shifts. The breeze continues. The tea house owner, whose name you have learned is Mahmoud, has noticed your fascination with the wind catcher. He sets down his own glass of tea and gestures for you to follow him. You climb a narrow staircase at the back of the building, then another, and then a ladder that brings you onto the roof. From here, you can see the badger up close, and Mahmoud begins to explain its secrets in detail. The tower is octagonal, about 12 meters tall from its base to the decorative cap at the top. Each of its 8 sides has an opening, a tall rectangular slot covered with wooden louvers that can be adjusted to control airflow. These louvers are one of the refinements that developed over centuries of experimentation. Early badgers had simple open holes, but builders discovered that adding adjustable screens allowed them to fine-tune the system for different wind conditions and seasons. Mahmoud points to the interior of the tower, visible through one of the openings. You can see that it is not just an empty shaft. There are internal walls, thin partitions of brick that divide the space into multiple channels. These partitions run all the way down to the base of the tower, creating separate pathways for air to flow. When the wind hits the tower from one direction, air rushes down through the channels on that side, while simultaneously being pulled up through the channels on the opposite side. This creates a continuous circulation that works even when the wind is barely perceptible. The physics behind this are elegant but not immediately obvious. When wind flows around a structure, it creates zones of high and low pressure. On the windward side, where the air impacts directly, pressure is high. On the leeward side, where the air has to curve around and rejoin, pressure is low. This pressure differential is what drives the airflow through the badger. High pressure pushes air into the windward openings, and low pressure pulls air out through the leeward ones. The building below becomes part of this circulation, with cool air descending and warm air rising in a continuous loop. But there is another effect at work, one that becomes important when there is no wind at all. This is what modern engineers call the stack effect, or sometimes thermal buoyancy. During the day, the sun heats the top of the tower, warming the air inside the upper sections of the shaft. Hot air is less dense than cold air, so it rises and exits through the top openings. This creates a vacuum effect that pulls cooler air up from the building below. The building, in turn, draws fresh air in through doorways and windows, creating a gentle circulation even on perfectly still days. Scholars have studied this phenomenon extensively, using computer models and physical measurements to understand exactly how efficient these systems can be. The results vary depending on the specific design of the badge, the climate conditions, and how well the system is integrated with other cooling features like courtyards and courtyard pools. But in general, a well-designed badge can reduce indoor temperatures by anywhere from 8 to 15 degrees Celsius compared to outside, while also significantly improving air quality by constantly exchanging stale indoor air for fresh outdoor air. Mahmoud leads you back down from the roof and into the main cooling chamber, the room directly beneath the badge where the effects are most pronounced. You can feel the difference immediately. The air here is noticeably cooler and fresher than in the rest of the building. Looking up, you can see the bottom of the shaft, a complex arrangement of channels opening into the ceiling. Below this, there is a shallow basin of water, perhaps a meter across, connected by a narrow channel to what Mahmoud tells you is the building's qanat access point. This is where the real magic happens. The water in the basin evaporates slowly, absorbing heat from the air. The air that descends through the badge passes over this water before entering the room, picking up moisture and losing heat. The combination of wind-driven ventilation and evaporative cooling can reduce temperatures dramatically, especially in the dry climate of the Persian Plateau, where humidity is low and evaporation happens quickly. There is a name for this process in modern engineering. It is called a passive downdraft evaporative cooling system. Universities around the world teach courses about it. Research papers analyze its efficiency. Architects incorporate versions of it into high-tech sustainable buildings. But the Persians figured it out through trial and error, over generations of experimentation, without calculus or computer models or peer-reviewed journals. They just paid attention to what worked and built more of it. One fascinating detail that Mahmoud shares is about the materials used in construction. The mud brick that makes up most of the badge is not ordinary mud brick. It contains specific additives, straw and animal dung, and sometimes egg whites that give it particular thermal properties. The exact recipes vary by region and were often family secrets, passed down from builder to builder. Some of these recipes produced bricks that are remarkably good at absorbing heat slowly during the day and releasing it slowly at night, smoothing out the temperature swings that would otherwise make desert life unbearable. Historians still debate exactly when and where the badge was invented. Some archaeological evidence suggests that wind-catching structures existed in ancient Egypt, and similar systems have been found in archaeological sites throughout the Middle East. But the Persian badger, as a refined and standardized technology, seems to have reached its peak during the Islamic Golden Age, roughly from the 8th to the 14th century. During this period, Persian builders spread their knowledge throughout the Islamic world, and variations of the badger appeared in cities from Baghdad to Cairo to Seville. You spend the rest of the afternoon in the cooling chamber, asking Mahmud questions and watching the patterns of light shift on the walls as the sun moves across the sky. He tells you about the annual maintenance that the badger requires, cleaning dust and debris from the channels, checking the louvers for damage, occasionally replastering sections that have cracked or worn away. It is not zero maintenance, but it is far less than any mechanical system would require. And when something does break, the repairs can be done with local materials and traditional skills. No spare parts need to be shipped from far away. No specialized technicians need to be called in. As evening approaches, you notice something interesting happening. The direction of the airflow is reversing. During the day, when the outside air was hot, the badger was pulling cool air up from the qanat and basement levels, circulating it through the building and exhausting warm air out the top. But now, as the outside temperature drops below the temperature inside the massive walls of the building, the flow is changing. The walls, which absorbed heat all day, are now warmer than the outside air, and the badger is helping to flush this stored heat out of the building. This nighttime purging is crucial to the system's effectiveness. The building mass acts like a thermal battery, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it at night. The badger accelerates this cycle, ensuring that the building starts each morning as cool as possible, ready to absorb another day's worth of heat. Without this nighttime flushing, the walls would gradually accumulate heat over the course of summer, and by August, the building would be unbearably warm no matter how well the ventilation worked. Mahmud invites you to stay for dinner, and you accept. The meal is simple but delicious, rice with herbs and a stew of lamb and dried limes. You eat on the roof, watching the stars emerge and feeling the cool night air wash over the city. The badgers are working in reverse now, exhaling the day's heat into the darkness. Tomorrow they will begin again, breathing cool air down into homes and shops and tea houses, keeping this ancient city alive in a climate that should have made settlement impossible. You lie back on a cushion and listen to the wind singing softly through the towers. It is a sound that people have listened to for 1,000 years, a lullaby of intelligent design, of humans working with nature instead of against it. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks, then falls silent. The stars wheel slowly overhead. The city sleeps, cooled by nothing but wind and water and wisdom. The next morning, Mahmud introduces you to a friend of his, a man named Rashid, who works as what he calls a qanat keeper. This is a profession that has existed in Persia for approximately 3,000 years, possibly longer. Rashid's family has been maintaining qanats for 11 generations. He knows these underground channels the way you might know the streets of your hometown, by feel, by instinct, by countless hours spent in their company. Rashid offers to show you one of the qanats, and you accept immediately. You follow him through the city, past the mud brick houses and the wind towers, out toward the edge of town where the buildings thin out and the desert begins. After about 20 minutes of walking, he stops beside what looks like a simple hole in the ground, perhaps a meter across, lined with brick and covered with a wooden grate. This, Rashid explains, is a shaft. Not the qanat itself, but an access point, one of many that dot the landscape between here and the mountains. The qanat runs underground, following a very gentle slope from a water source high in the hills to the city below. These shafts were dug to remove debris during construction and to provide ventilation and access for maintenance. Looking out across the desert, you can see a line of similar holes stretching toward the mountains, each one marking a point along the hidden channel below. Rashid lifts the grate and begins to climb down a ladder built into the shaft wall. You follow, trying not to think about the fact that you are descending into a 3,000-year-old tunnel system maintained by a family who learned their trade before your country existed. The shaft goes down about 15 meters before opening into the qanat channel itself. At the bottom, you step off the ladder and onto a narrow stone ledge beside a flowing stream of water. The water is shockingly cold. Rashid dips his hand in and invites you to do the same. It feels like glacier melt, which is essentially what it is. This water fell as snow on the mountains months ago, melted slowly, seeped into the ground, and has been flowing through underground channels ever since, staying cold because it never sees the sun. By the time it reaches the city, it is cool enough to make ice cream without refrigeration. The Persians, being practical people, used it for exactly that purpose. The qanat channel is about 1.5 meters tall and perhaps a meter wide, carved through rock and clay and lined in places with carefully fitted stones. Rashid has brought a small lantern, and in its flickering light, you can see the walls stretching off into darkness in both directions. The water flows steadily past your feet, clear and clean, making a soft gurgling sound as it moves over slight irregularities in the channel floor. The air is cool and damp and smells faintly of minerals and earth. Here is how a qanat works, in the simplest terms possible. Water naturally collects underground in areas called aquifers, layers of permeable rock or gravel that hold water like a sponge. In mountainous regions, these aquifers are often fed by snowmelt and rainfall, and they can contain enormous amounts of water. The challenge is accessing that water and moving it to where people need it. The Persian solution was to dig a gently sloping tunnel from the aquifer to the city. The tunnel stays underground the entire way, protected from evaporation and contamination. Because the starting point is higher than the ending point, gravity does all the work of moving the water. No pumps are needed. No energy is required. Once the qanat is built, it runs essentially forever, or at least until the aquifer dries up or the tunnel collapses. The genius is in the slope. A qanat must descend at a very specific gradient, steep enough that water flows, but gentle enough that the flow does not erode the channel walls. Traditional qanat builders, the muqannis, could calculate this gradient with astonishing accuracy using nothing but simple tools and accumulated wisdom. Scholars have measured ancient qanats and found that their slopes are often within a fraction of a degree of optimal, achieved without modern surveying equipment or engineering degrees. Rashid leads you along the channel, walking against the flow of water toward the source. The tunnel is mostly straight, but curves occasionally to avoid particularly hard rock or unstable soil. Every few hundred meters, there is another shaft rising to the surface, letting in a column of dim light and fresh air. These shafts also mark points where debris can be removed and where workers can enter for maintenance. The entire system is designed for longevity, for the possibility that someone will need to repair it centuries in the future. As you walk, Rashid tells you about the history of qanats in Persia. The earliest known qanats date to around the 1st millennium BCE, during the time of the Achaemenid Empire. Some historians believe the technology may be even older, developed gradually over centuries of experimentation with irrigation and water management. By the time of the Persian Empire, qanats were a sophisticated and widely used technology, and the Persians spread them throughout their territory, from Afghanistan to Egypt. One remarkable thing about qanats is how many of them still function today. Researchers estimate that Iran alone has over 30,000 qanats, some of which have been in continuous operation for 2,000 years or more. That is an extraordinary longevity for any piece of infrastructure. Most modern water systems require constant maintenance and occasional complete replacement. Qanats, built properly, can outlast civilizations. The downside, of course, is that they are labor-intensive to build. Rashid tells you that constructing a new qanat typically took years or even decades, depending on its length. Teams of muqannis would work from both ends and from the access shafts, slowly excavating the channel and removing the debris by hand. It was dangerous work. Tunnels could collapse. Workers could suffocate from bad air. Some qanats required digging through solid rock, which had to be broken up with fire and water before being carried out in baskets. Historians still debate who funded the construction of the great qanats. Some were clearly royal projects built by emperors to supply major cities or to irrigate agricultural land. Others seem to have been community efforts, built gradually over generations by villages pooling their labor. Still others were private investments, built by wealthy landowners who then charged farmers for access to the water. The economic and social arrangements around qanats were complex and varied from region to region and period to period. You have been walking for perhaps half an hour when Rashid stops and points to the wall of the tunnel. In the flickering lantern light, you can see something carved into the stone. It is writing, old Persian script, carved by someone long ago. Rashid translates roughly, "It is a blessing, asking for protection for those who work in the tunnel and for abundance for those who use its water." Similar inscriptions have been found in Qanats throughout Iran, testaments to the spiritual significance that people attach to these life-giving channels. The return journey passes quickly. You emerge from the shaft blinking in the bright sunlight, your clothes damp from the humidity underground, your mind full of new understanding. The water that flows through this Qarnat will reach the city in a few hours, where it will fill fountains, irrigate gardens, supply bathhouses, and cool the air in homes equipped with badgers. It will make ice in the winter and keep food fresh in the summer. It will sustain life in a place where life should not be sustainable. As you walk back toward the city, Rashid points out the subtle signs of the Qarnat's presence. A line of slightly greener vegetation, a gentle depression in the ground, the access shafts marching toward the mountains like a dotted line drawn across the landscape. Most people never notice these things, he says. They take the water for granted. They turn on a tap and water comes out, and they do not think about the 3,000-year-old tunnel beneath their feet that makes it all possible. You think about that as you enter the city again, passing through the narrow streets and under the wind towers. Every drop of water here is precious. Every cup of tea, every splashing fountain, every cool bath represents an extraordinary investment of human labor and ingenuity. The Persians did not just survive in the desert. They flourished. They built an empire. They created one of the great civilizations of human history. And they did it, in large part, by figuring out how to move water through the earth without using any energy at all. Rashid has offered to introduce you to his uncle, Hossein, who is one of the last practicing muqannis in the region. The muqannis are the Qarnat builders and maintainers, a profession that has been passed down through families for generations. Their knowledge is partly technical and partly mystical, a combination of practical engineering skills and traditions that border on the sacred. You are eager to learn more, so you accept the invitation. Hossein lives in a small house on the outskirts of the city, near the line of Qarnat shafts that you visited yesterday. He is an older man, probably in his 70s, with hands that tell the story of decades of manual labor. His fingers are thick and calloused, and one of them is missing, lost in a tunnel accident many years ago. Despite his age, he moves with surprising energy, clearly pleased to have a visitor interested in his work. Over glasses of strong black tea, Hossein explains how a Qarnat is built. The first step, he says, is finding water. This is not as simple as it sounds. The aquifer is underground, invisible, and its location can only be determined through careful observation and experience. Traditional muqannis looked for certain signs, particular plants that only grow where there is underground water, subtle differences in soil color, the behavior of animals, even the taste of the wind on certain days. Some of these techniques have been validated by modern hydrogeology. Others remain mysterious, passed down through oral tradition without scientific explanation. Once a likely water source is identified, the next step is to dig a test shaft straight down until water is reached. This shaft, called the mother well, establishes both the depth of the aquifer and the quality of the water. If the results are promising, the real work begins, digging the tunnel from the mother well to the destination, maintaining a precise and constant slope the entire way. The tools of the Mukanis are simple: a pickaxe for loosening soil and rock, a shovel for moving debris, a windlass for lifting material out of the shafts, and perhaps most importantly, a leveling instrument for maintaining the correct slope. Traditional Mukanis used a device similar to a carpenter's level, a wooden frame with a plumb bob that could detect even tiny variations in gradient. Getting this slope wrong could be disastrous. Too steep, and the water would flow too fast, eroding the channel walls. Too gentle, and the water would pool and stagnate. Hossein describes the experience of working underground. The tunnels are narrow, often so cramped that workers must crawl or lie on their backs to excavate. Ventilation is a constant concern. In long tunnels far from the access shafts, the air can become stale and dangerous. Workers learn to bring candles with them, not just for light, but as early warning systems. If the candle flame began to dim or change color, it meant the oxygen was running low and it was time to retreat. There were other dangers too. Cave-ins were common, especially when digging through loose soil or when vibrations from the surface, perhaps from heavy carts or large animals, disturbed the tunnel ceiling. Flash floods could occur if the tunnel accidentally broke into an unexpected underground water pocket. Poisonous gases sometimes accumulated in certain geological formations. The Mukanis had prayers and rituals for each of these dangers, invoking divine protection before beginning each day's work. Scholars have studied the social organization of Qanat construction, and what they have found is fascinating. The Mukanis operated almost like a guild, with masters training apprentices over many years. Knowledge was not written down but transmitted orally and through practice. There were initiation ceremonies, secret techniques, and a strong sense of professional identity. In some communities, the Mukanis were revered figures, their skills seen as almost magical. In others, they were simply respected craftsmen, well paid for dangerous and difficult work. The construction of a major Qanat was a community undertaking. Different families might be responsible for different sections of the tunnel. A village might work on its Qanat for decades, each generation adding a few more meters until finally the water reached its destination. There are stories of Qanats that took 100 years to complete, with the great-great-grandchildren of the original planners finally seeing water flow for the first time. Hossein takes you outside to show you some of his tools. The pickaxe is surprisingly small, designed for confined spaces. The shovel is narrow and long-handled. There is a ceramic oil lamp that he used before battery-powered lights became available, its shape optimized to stay lit even in the drafty conditions underground. And there is the level, a wooden device that looks deceptively simple but requires great skill to use accurately. He also shows you something unexpected, a collection of small figurines carved from bone or soft stone, depicting workers and animals and abstract symbols. These are protective charms, he explains, carried by Mukanis for luck and safety. Some are very old, passed down through generations. Others are newer, made by Hossein himself during long hours underground. The tradition of making these charms goes back centuries, maybe longer. Archaeologists have found similar objects in ancient Qanat sites, suggesting that the spiritual dimension of this work is as old as the technical dimension. The economic structure of Qanat construction is another topic that historians still debate. Building a Qanat was expensive, requiring years of labor by skilled workers. Who paid for it? In some cases, the answer was clear: a king or governor who wanted to develop agricultural land or supply a new city. But many Qanats were built by communities or cooperatives, with complex arrangements for sharing both the costs and the benefits. Water rights associated with Qanats became a specialized area of Islamic law, with detailed rules about who could take how much water and when. Hossein tells you about a Qanat he helped build as a young man, a relatively short one, only about 3 kilometers long, that took 5 years to complete. He still remembers the day the water first flowed through, the sense of accomplishment, the celebration that followed. The village that commissioned the Qanat had struggled with water shortages for decades. Now they had a reliable supply, enough for drinking, bathing, irrigation, and animals. The Qanat changed everything for them. But he also tells you about the sadness of watching many Qanats fall into disrepair. As modern pumped wells became available, many communities abandoned their traditional Qanats. Pumps were faster and easier, and they did not require the specialized skills of the Mukanis. What people did not realize at first was that pumps could drain aquifers much faster than they recharged. Qanats, by their nature, could only take water as fast as the aquifer refilled. Pumps had no such limitation. Today, many regions that switch to pumped water are facing serious water crises. Their aquifers are depleted. Their pumps bring up only mud. And the old Qanats, neglected for decades, have collapsed or silted up. There is a growing movement to restore these ancient systems, to bring back the sustainable water management that sustained Persian civilization for millennia. Hossein is part of this movement, training a new generation of Mukanis, trying to preserve knowledge that was nearly lost. As you leave Hossein's house, he gives you a small carved figure, a charm of your own. It depicts a figure digging, bent over in the characteristic posture of tunnel work. He says it will bring you luck in your own journeys underground, whether literal or metaphorical. You accept it gratefully, feeling the weight of tradition in your palm. The sun is setting as you walk back toward the city. The access shafts along the Kanat line cast long shadows across the desert. Somewhere beneath your feet, water is flowing, cold and clean, the same water that flowed here 1,000 years ago, the same water that will flow here 1,000 years from now, if people continue to care for the tunnels. It is a humbling thought, a reminder of how small one human life is against the scale of these works, and how important each individual effort can be in maintaining them. A few days into your journey through ancient Persian cooling technology, Mahmoud mentions something that stops you mid-sip of your morning tea. He says the word casually, as if it were the most normal thing in the world, but to your modern ears, it sounds like a contradiction. Ice house. In the desert. In a place where summer temperatures routinely exceed 40 degrees Celsius. You ask him to repeat himself, certain you have misunderstood. He smiles and says yes, ice house. Yakhchal, in Persian, literally meaning ice pit. He offers to take you to see one, and within the hour you are walking out of the city in a different direction than you went to see the Kanats. The Yakhchal appears on the horizon like something from a dream. It is a massive dome, perhaps 15 or 20 meters tall, rising out of the flat desert floor. The structure is made of the same mud brick as everything else in this region, but its shape is unlike anything you have seen. It looks almost like a beehive, or perhaps a giant cone with the top rounded off. There are walls extending from either side of it, long and tall, casting broad shadows across the ground. As you get closer, you can see that the dome is even larger than it appeared from a distance. The walls at its base are incredibly thick, perhaps 2 meters or more, built from a special mortar that Mahmoud calls saruj. This material, a mixture of sand, clay, lime, egg whites, goat hair, and ash, is almost waterproof and has excellent insulating properties. The recipe has been refined over centuries, and buildings made from it can last for hundreds of years with minimal maintenance. You walk around to the entrance, a low doorway on the north side of the structure. Stepping inside, you feel the temperature drop immediately, dramatically. It must be 15 or 20 degrees cooler in here than outside. The interior is dim, lit only by the light filtering through the entrance and through a small vent at the top of the dome. And there, in the center of the space, is something impossible, a pit filled with ice. The ice is covered with straw and sawdust, insulators that slow melting. Even so, pools of water have formed around the edges where some melting has occurred. Workers periodically drain this water and add fresh insulation. The ice itself was made during winter, Mahmoud explains, and stored here for use throughout the summer. In a good year, with proper management, ice from a yakhchal can last until the following winter, providing cold storage and frozen treats for an entire year. You stand there, staring at the ice, trying to wrap your mind around what you are seeing. This is ice in the desert in summer, made and stored without any technology that would be recognizable to a modern engineer. No compressors, no refrigerants, no electricity of any kind. Just clever architecture, an understanding of physics, and a lot of patience. Here is how it works. During the cold desert nights of winter, temperatures can drop below freezing, sometimes well below. The Persians took advantage of this by building shallow pools beside their yakhchals, broad and flat, only a few centimeters deep. They would fill these pools with water from the qanats in the evening. The water would spread out thin across the large surface area, maximizing exposure to the cold night air. As the night progressed, the water would cool rapidly. But there is a trick here that makes the system work even when air temperatures are slightly above freezing. It is called radiative cooling. On clear nights, heat radiates directly from the surface of the water up into the atmosphere, escaping into space. This radiation can cool the water below the ambient air temperature, allowing ice to form even when thermometers would suggest it should not be possible. The Persians did not understand the physics in modern terms, but they understood the phenomenon intimately through observation and experimentation. The walls extending from the yakhchal serve an important purpose in this process. During the day, they shade the freezing pools, keeping them as cold as possible and preventing premature melting. They also block the warm winds that blow across the desert, creating a sheltered microclimate around the pools. The orientation of the walls is carefully calculated to maximize shade during the day while allowing clear sky exposure at night. Once ice has formed, workers break it into manageable pieces and carry it into the yakhchal for storage. The dome shape of the structure is not just decorative. It is thermodynamically optimal for storing cold. Hot air rises, so it collects at the top of the dome, away from the ice below. The small vent at the apex allows this warm air to escape, while the thick walls prevent new heat from entering. The ice pit at the center is dug deep into the ground, taking advantage of the Earth's naturally cool and stable temperature. Scholars have measured the temperature inside functioning yakhchals and found that they can maintain near freezing conditions even when outside temperatures exceed 40 degrees. This is an extraordinary achievement, a testament to the sophistication of Persian engineering. Some historians argue that the yakhchal represents one of the earliest examples of what we would now call passive refrigeration, a technology that would not be redeveloped in the West until the 19th century. The uses for yakhchal ice were varied. Obviously, it was used for cooling drinks and making frozen desserts. Sharbat, the sweet fruit drink that is the ancestor of modern sherbet and sorbet, was traditionally served over ice from yakhchals. But ice also had medical uses. Physicians prescribed it for fever and inflammation. It was used to preserve food, extending the shelf life of meat, dairy, and produce. And it was a luxury good, a sign of wealth and sophistication, something that hosts would offer to guests to demonstrate their prosperity. You spend a long time in the yakchal, just enjoying the cool and marveling at the ingenuity. Mahmud sits on a ledge near the entrance, patient as always, letting you absorb the experience at your own pace. He tells you that there were once hundreds of yakchals in this region, perhaps thousands across all of Persia. Most are now ruins, abandoned when modern refrigeration made them obsolete. But a few still function, maintained by traditionalists and historians who understand their cultural importance. The construction of a yakchal was a significant undertaking, requiring skilled architects and a large workforce. The dome had to be built carefully, layer by layer, with each course of bricks slightly smaller than the one below it, gradually curving inward until the top closed. The walls had to be precisely positioned to provide optimal shade. The freezing pools had to be level and properly drained, and the whole structure had to be oriented correctly with respect to the prevailing winds and the path of the sun. There is ongoing debate among historians about when the first yakchals were built. Some evidence suggests that ice storage existed in Persia as early as 400 BCE during the Achaemenid period. Other scholars argue that the sophisticated dome structures we see today developed later, perhaps during the Sasanian Empire or the early Islamic period. The truth is hard to determine because mud brick does not preserve well in the archaeological record, and many yakchals have been rebuilt multiple times over the centuries. What is clear is that by the medieval period, yakchals were a well-established technology and their products were an important part of Persian culture. There are accounts from travelers and historians describing the ice trade, with caravans carrying ice from mountain regions to cities in the lowlands. There are references to royal ice houses built on a grand scale to supply the court with frozen luxuries. And there are recipes, preserved in old cookbooks, for frozen desserts that required yakchal ice to prepare. As you leave the yakchal and walk back toward the city, the heat hits you like a wall. You had almost forgotten how oppressive it was, your body having adjusted to the cool interior. But now you understand something that you did not understand before. The desert was not an obstacle that the Persians merely endured. It was a resource that they learned to exploit. The same extreme temperature swings that make the climate so harsh also made ice production possible. The clear, dry air that scorches by day radiates heat efficiently at night. The very conditions that seem hostile to life are, with the right knowledge and technology, the conditions that make frozen treats in summer possible. Your visit to the yakchal has left you with questions. You understand, in a general way, that ice forms in the shallow pools during winter nights. But the details still seem almost magical. How exactly does ice form when the air temperature might be just a few degrees below freezing, or even slightly above? How did the Persians optimize this process over centuries? What are the precise conditions that make it work? Is less than has hone. 5 hash is greater than. Mahmoud arranges for you to meet with a local scholar, a man named Farhad, who has spent decades studying traditional Persian technologies. Farhad is a professor at a university in Tehran but spends part of each year in Yazd, researching and documenting the old systems before the knowledge is lost entirely. He agrees to explain the physics of ice production in detail. The conversation takes place in a shaded courtyard, the air cooled by a badgir and a central pool. Farhad begins by explaining the concept of radiative cooling, which is the key to understanding how ice can form even when air temperatures are above freezing. Every object, he says, radiates heat in the form of infrared radiation. During the day, this radiation is balanced by incoming radiation from the sun and from the atmosphere. But at night, especially on clear nights, the balance shifts. An object exposed to the clear night sky can radiate heat directly into space, cooling itself below the temperature of the surrounding air. This effect is stronger in dry climates because water vapor in the atmosphere absorbs and re-radiates infrared radiation, acting like a blanket that keeps surfaces warm. In the desert, where humidity is very low, this blanket is thin or non-existent. A surface exposed to the clear desert sky can cool itself significantly below air temperature, sometimes by 10 degrees or more. This is why dew forms on surfaces in the desert even when the air temperature is well above the dew point, and it is why ice can form in shallow pools even when the air temperature is a few degrees above freezing. The Persians optimized this effect through careful design of their freezing pools. The pools were shallow, typically only 5 to 10 centimeters deep, which meant the water had a very large surface area relative to its volume. This maximized radiative cooling and minimized the amount of heat that needed to be removed to freeze the water. The pools were also wide and flat, oriented to have a clear view of the northern sky, where there was no sun to interfere with the cooling process. The walls beside the pools served multiple purposes. During the day, they shaded the pools, preventing solar heating and allowing the water to stay cold. At night, they blocked warm winds that might otherwise warm the water surface. But the walls were positioned carefully to allow cold air, which is denser than warm air, to drain down into the pool area. This created a natural cold air pool, further lowering temperatures around the freezing surfaces. Farhad explains that the timing of water application was also crucial. The pools were filled in the evening, after the sun had set but before the coldest part of the night. This allowed maximum time for radiative cooling to work. Workers would check the pools throughout the night, and if ice had formed, they would break it off and move it to the Yakchal before dawn, when temperatures began to rise again. There is another factor that the Persians understood intuitively, but that modern scientists have only recently begun to study systematically. The dissolved salts and gases in water affect its freezing point and the quality of ice it produces. Water from the qanats, which had been filtered through miles of underground rock, was remarkably pure, with low levels of dissolved minerals. This pure water froze more easily and produced clearer, harder ice that melted more slowly. Farhad says that some Yakchal operators were quite particular about their water sources, preferring certain qanats over others based on the quality of ice they produced. Scholars have debated exactly how efficient these ice-making operations were. Modern researchers have built experimental replicas of Persian freezing pools and tested them under various conditions. The results suggest that on a good winter night, a large pool could produce several centimeters of ice across its entire surface, potentially hundreds of kilograms of ice from a single freezing cycle. Over the course of a winter, a well-managed yakhchal operation could produce and store enough ice to supply a medium-sized city for an entire year. The logistics of ice production were surprisingly complex. Workers had to monitor weather conditions to know when freezing would be possible. They had to manage the water supply, filling and draining the pools on the right schedule. They had to break up the ice and transport it to the yakhchal quickly before it began to melt. And they had to layer the ice properly in the storage pit, packing it tightly and covering it with insulation to minimize air gaps and melting. Farhad shows you some diagrams he has made, documenting the layout of historic freezing operations. The pools were typically arranged in rows, with channels connecting them to a qanat supply. The walls were built in a specific pattern, creating a series of sheltered zones that could be used in sequence depending on wind direction. The yakhchal itself was positioned to receive ice from the pools with minimum travel distance. Everything was designed for efficiency, to produce as much ice as possible during the short window of opportunity that winter provided. One fascinating detail is that the Persians experimented with additives to improve ice production. Some historical sources mention mixing straw or chaff with the water in the pools. The purpose of this is debated, but one theory is that the particles provided nucleation sites, places where ice crystals could begin to form more easily. Modern physics confirms that ice nucleation is enhanced by the presence of certain types of particles, so this traditional practice may have had a sound scientific basis. The decline of traditional ice making came gradually as modern refrigeration technology became available. By the early 20th century, ice factories using mechanical compressors were operating in Persian cities, producing ice more cheaply and reliably than the yakhchals could manage. The old ice houses fell into disuse, their techniques forgotten by all but a few specialists. But there is growing interest in reviving these technologies, not just as historical curiosities but as practical solutions to modern problems. In a world facing energy shortages and climate change, the idea of producing ice without electricity has obvious appeal. Researchers are studying traditional Persian techniques to see if they can be adapted for modern use. Some architects are incorporating radiative cooling principles into building designs. The old knowledge, it turns out, may still have something to teach us. As you leave Farhad's courtyard, your mind is full of new understanding. The ice in the yakhchal is not a miracle, but it is remarkable. It represents the accumulated wisdom of generations, observation refined into technique, technique refined into tradition. The Persians did not have thermodynamics textbooks or computer simulations. They had patience, curiosity, and the willingness to experiment. And out of those simple ingredients, they created ice in the desert. Making ice is only half the challenge. The other half, perhaps the harder half, is keeping it frozen through the brutal summer months when temperatures climb past 40 degrees and the sun beats down relentlessly on everything below. This is where the Yakhchal Dome proves its genius, and why Farhad has offered to show you the interior of a particularly well-preserved example in more detail. The Yakhchal you are visiting today is older than the one Mahmud showed you, perhaps 600 or 700 years old, based on the style of its construction. It has been restored in recent years and is now part of a conservation project, maintained as a working example of traditional technology. Farhad has a key to the interior and leads you through a narrow passage that zigzags before opening into the main storage chamber. The zigzag entrance is not a quirk of design, but a deliberate feature. Straight passages would allow warm air to flow directly into the storage space. The bends create what engineers call an airlock, a series of turns that slow down air exchange and prevent convective heat transfer. Each bend in the passage is like a door that warm air has to negotiate, losing heat at every turn. By the time any outside air reaches the storage chamber, it has been significantly cooled. Inside, the dome rises above you like the interior of a cathedral, curved walls stretching up toward a small opening at the apex. This opening is the only other ventilation point, and it serves a specific purpose. Hot air, being less dense than cold air, naturally rises. As the storage chamber warms during the day, the warmest air collects at the top of the dome, right beneath the apex. This warm air can then escape through the vent, carrying heat away from the precious ice below. The shape of the dome maximizes this effect. The curved walls provide the largest possible volume for a given surface area, minimizing the ratio of heat-conducting surface to cold-storing space. The height of the dome ensures that even the warmest air is separated from the ice by many meters of progressively cooler air. And the thickness of the walls, constructed from that remarkable Sarouge mortar, provides an enormous amount of thermal mass that resists temperature changes. Farhad has brought temperature sensors and shows you the readings. Outside, it is 38 degrees Celsius. At the entrance to the passage, it is 31. At the first bend, 26. At the second bend, 22. Inside the main chamber, near the ice pit, it is 14 degrees. And the ice itself, insulated beneath layers of straw and sawdust, is right at freezing. This gradient, from brutal heat to frozen water, is maintained entirely through passive means, without any mechanical assistance. The ice pit at the center of the chamber is deeper than it appeared at first glance, extending several meters into the ground. This excavation serves multiple purposes. First, it puts the ice below ground level, where temperatures are naturally more stable. The Earth acts as an enormous thermal mass, staying cool through the summer and warm through the winter, moderating the extremes of the surface climate. Second, the pit allows cold air, which is denser than warm air, to settle at the bottom, creating a pool of cold that surrounds the ice on all sides. The construction of the pit walls is another detail that shows the sophistication of Persian engineering. They are lined with a special plaster that is nearly waterproof, preventing groundwater from seeping in and contaminating the ice. The floor slopes slightly toward a drain, allowing meltwater to escape rather than pooling around the remaining ice. This drainage is crucial because water in contact with ice accelerates melting, transferring heat much more efficiently than air. Farhad explains the traditional techniques for packing ice into the pit. Workers would bring ice from the freezing pools in baskets, dumping it into the pit and compacting it by treading on it with their feet. Between layers, they would spread straw or sawdust, creating insulating barriers that slowed heat transfer. The goal was to create a solid mass with as few air gaps as possible, since air gaps allow convection and accelerate melting. The amount of ice that a large yakhchal could store is impressive. Farhad estimates that the pit you are standing beside could hold several hundred tons of ice at capacity. Even with continuous melting throughout the summer, this is enough to supply a significant population with ice for drinks, food preservation, and medical uses. Some of the largest yakhchals, built to supply royal courts or major cities, could hold even more. Historians have documented the complex social and economic systems that grew up around yakhchals. Ice was a valuable commodity, and yakhchal owners were important figures in their communities. There were hereditary families whose business was ice production, just as there were hereditary families of mukanis for the konats. Some yakhchals were communal property, maintained by the village as a whole. Others were private investments, with owners selling ice to merchants who distributed it through the city. One interesting detail that scholars still debate is the role of night lighting in yakhchal management. Some historical sources mention lamps being kept burning inside yakhchals, which seems counterproductive given that the goal is to keep the space as cold as possible. One theory is that the lamps were purely ceremonial, part of the spiritual practices associated with ice production. Another theory is that small flames actually helped by creating convection currents that moved warm air toward the apex vent. Modern thermodynamic analysis suggests this second theory might have some merit, though the effect would be small. The cultural significance of ice extended beyond its practical uses. There are poems about ice, praising its purity and its miraculous presence in the summer heat. There are proverbs and sayings that reference ice, using it as a metaphor for coolness under pressure or for things that seem impossible. There are stories of rulers who demonstrated their power by offering ice to foreign ambassadors, who could not understand how such a thing was possible in such a climate. As you prepare to leave the yakhchal, Farhad offers you a small piece of ice, chipped from the edge of the storage pit. You hold it in your hand, feeling its cold against your palm, watching it begin to melt in the warm air of the passage. This ice was made months ago, frozen on a cold winter night and stored here ever since. It is a tangible connection to the past, a small miracle of engineering and patience held in your hand. Outside, the heat is waiting. You step from the cool interior into the afternoon sun and feel the contrast like a physical blow. The ice in your hand melts quickly now, trickling between your fingers and dripping onto the dusty ground. In a minute, it will be gone, evaporated into the dry air. But somewhere beneath that dome, tons more remain, cold and patient, waiting to be used. All of this technology, the Carnats and the Badgers and the Yakchols, served many purposes. But one of the most delightful purposes, and perhaps the one that best captures the Persian attitude toward life, was the production of cold drinks. The Persians did not just survive in the desert. They created pleasures, refined enjoyments, small daily luxuries that made life not just bearable, but beautiful. And among the most beloved of these pleasures was Sharbat. Mahmud takes you to a Sharbat cellar in the old bazaar, a tiny shop wedged between a carpet merchant and a coppersmith. The owner is an elderly woman named Fatima, who has been making Sharbat from family recipes for over 50 years. Her shop is barely big enough for 3 customers, but it has a devoted following. People come from across the city for her rose water and saffron blend, a drink that she claims was perfected by her great-great-grandmother during the Qajar dynasty. The word Sharbat comes from the Arabic word for drink, which itself comes from the verb meaning to drink. From Persian and Arabic, the word traveled to Europe, where it became sherbet in English and sorbet in French. But these European versions, whether as frozen desserts or fizzy powders, are distant descendants of the original. True Persian Sharbat is something else entirely, an intensely flavored syrup diluted with cold water and served over ice. Fatima shows you her collection of syrups, stored in glass jars that line the walls of her shop. There is rose water, of course, pink and fragrant. There is saffron, golden and precious. There is sekanjabin, made from vinegar and honey, a combination that sounds strange but tastes surprisingly refreshing. There is sharbati albalu, made from sour cherries. There is limo shirin, made from sweet limes. And there are dozens more, each one representing a traditional recipe refined over generations. The preparation is simple but precise. Fatima takes a tall glass and fills it partially with ice chips, which come from a small ice chest behind her counter. In the old days, this ice would have come from a yakchol. Today it comes from a freezer, but Fatima insists the traditional ice was superior, harder, and slower to melt. She adds a generous pour of syrup, perhaps 2 or 3 tablespoons, then fills the glass with cold water and stirs briefly. The result is a drink that is sweet, cold, aromatic, and intensely satisfying. You take your first sip, and the flavor hits you like a revelation. The rose water is floral without being cloying. The cold is sharp and clean. The sweetness is balanced by something else, a subtle bitterness from the roses, a hint of complexity that keeps the drink interesting sip after sip. You understand immediately why people have been making this for centuries, why recipes have been guarded and refined, why the arrival of ice in summer was a celebration. The history of Sharbat is intertwined with the history of Persian medicine. Traditional physicians prescribed specific sharbats for specific ailments. Rosewater sharbat was cooling and calming, good for headaches and fevers. Sekanjabin was digestive and invigorating, recommended for stomach troubles. Mint sharbat cooled the body and freshened the breath. These prescriptions were based on the humoral theory of medicine, which divided substances into hot and cold, wet and dry, and sought to balance them within the body. Historians have traced the spread of Sharbat from Persia throughout the Islamic world and eventually to Europe. Arab traders brought the concept to Sicily and Spain, where it evolved into new forms. The Mughals took it to India, where it mixed with local traditions to create new varieties. By the 17th century, Sharbat had reached England and France, where it was considered an exotic delicacy. The transformation into modern sherbet and sorbet happened gradually, as European cooks adapted the recipes to their own tastes and available ingredients. But in Persia, Sharbat remained largely unchanged, a living tradition maintained by families like Fatima's. The recipes might vary from region to region and family to family, but the basic concept remained the same: a sweet syrup, cold water, ice. The ice was essential. A sharbat served at room temperature was barely worthy of the name. The cold was not just a physical sensation, but a psychological one, a signal that you were about to experience something special. Scholars have studied the cultural significance of offering cold drinks in Persian society. It was a mark of hospitality, a way of showing respect to guests. A host who could offer ice in summer was demonstrating wealth and sophistication. The first glass of sharbat offered to a visitor was often the most elaborate, the most carefully prepared, a statement of welcome. Refusing such an offering would be a serious social transgression. The connection between sharbat and the cooling technologies we have been exploring is direct and obvious. Without qanats, there would be no cold water to make sharbat. Without yakhchals, there would be no ice to chill it. Without badgers, there would be no comfortable spaces in which to drink it. The entire complex of Persian cooling technology comes together in this simple pleasure, this glass of sweetened water served cold in the heat of summer. Fatima tells you stories as you sip your sharbat. She talks about her grandmother, who learned the recipes from her grandmother before her. She talks about the ingredients, the roses grown in special gardens, the saffron harvested thread by thread. She talks about the changes she has seen, the refrigerators replacing the yakhchals, the bottled syrups replacing the homemade ones. Not all changes are for the worse, she admits. Refrigeration means ice is available year-round, not just when the yak holes are well stocked. But something has been lost too, some connection to the seasons, some appreciation for the difficulty of cold. You finish your sharbat and order another, this time the second jabin. The vinegar and honey combination is indeed strange at first sip, tangy and sweet in equal measure, but by the second sip you understand its appeal. It is refreshing in a different way than the rose water, more stimulating, more awakening. You can imagine drinking this on a hot afternoon when you needed to stay alert, when the sweet heaviness of rosewater would have been too soporific. The afternoon stretches on. Other customers come and go, each with their favorite flavor, each greeted by Fatima with warm familiarity. The ice chips clink in the glasses. The fans overhead turn slowly. Outside, the bazaar continues its eternal bustle, merchants calling their wares, customers haggling over prices, the life of the city continuing as it has for centuries, cooled by ancient technology and sweetened by ancient recipes. The common people of Persia had their badges and their kanats, their yakchals and their sharbat sellers. But what about the kings? Surely the rulers of one of the ancient world's greatest empires had something more elaborate, something befitting their status and power. The answer is yes, and the scale of royal cooling technology was truly astonishing. Mahmud has arranged for you to visit the remains of a royal palace complex on the outskirts of the city. Most of the structures have crumbled over the centuries, but enough remains to give a sense of how the Persian kings lived. And one thing is immediately clear: they lived cool. Very, very cool. The first thing you notice as you approach the palace grounds is the water. It is everywhere. Channels run along pathways, fountains play in courtyards, pools shimmer in the afternoon light. This is not decoration, or rather, it is not only decoration. Every drop of this water serves a cooling function, evaporating slowly and absorbing heat from the surrounding air. Walking along a channel, you can feel the temperature drop noticeably. Standing beside a fountain, the air is fresh and moist, a sharp contrast to the dry heat of the city streets. The palace had its own kanat system, separate from the public kanats that supplied the city. Royal kanats were often larger and better maintained, bringing more water and colder water to the palace grounds. Some royal kanats had multiple branches, allowing different parts of the palace to have independent water supplies. If one branch became contaminated or needed maintenance, the others could continue operating. But the really impressive cooling came from the integration of multiple systems working together. Imagine standing in a royal reception hall. Below your feet, a kanat runs, its cold water flowing through a channel built into the floor. The evaporation from this water cools the stone, and the stone cools the air. Above you, a badger draws hot air out of the space and pulls cool air in from underground chambers. The walls are thick, insulating you from the heat outside. and the courtyard you crossed to enter this room had a garden, shading the approach and cooling the air before it even reached the building. The architects of these spaces understood something that modern building designers sometimes forget. Cooling is not just about temperature, but about the flow of air, the perception of freshness, the psychological experience of comfort. A room might be objectively cool, but feel stuffy if the air is still. The Persian solution was to create gentle, constant air movement, using the pressure differentials of badgers and the buoyancy of warm air to generate breezes even on completely calm days. Scholars have studied the cooling systems of several royal palaces using modern instrumentation and computer modeling. The results are remarkable. In some cases, the passive cooling systems maintained indoor temperatures 15 to 20 degrees below outdoor temperatures, a performance that rivals modern air conditioning. And they achieved this while also providing excellent air quality, with complete air changes multiple times per hour. One feature of royal architecture that particularly impresses you is the talar, a high-ceilinged covered porch, open on one or more sides. These spaces were used for receiving guests, conducting business, and relaxing in the afternoon heat. They were positioned to catch breezes and were often built over pools of water. The combination of height, openness, shade, and water created spaces that were remarkably comfortable even on the hottest days. The aesthetic dimension of royal cooling was also important. The Persians did not just want to be cool, they wanted to feel cool, to see coolness, to be surrounded by the symbols and sensations of refreshment. This is why royal architecture made such extensive use of water features, blue tiles, green gardens, and shaded pavilions. These elements serve practical cooling functions, but they also serve psychological ones, creating an environment that looked and felt like refuge from the heat. One interesting detail that historians still debate is the use of ice in royal settings. We know that Yak Charles supplied ice for drinks and food preservation, but some sources suggest that ice was also used for direct space cooling in palaces. There are references to ice being piled in shallow basins in reception rooms, cooling the air as it melted. There are descriptions of underground chambers packed with ice, where the king might retreat during the worst of the summer heat. The logistics of this would have been challenging, requiring enormous quantities of ice, but for a king with unlimited resources, it would have been possible. The decline of the great palaces came gradually as dynasties rose and fell and capitals shifted. Some were destroyed by invaders. Others were simply abandoned as political power moved elsewhere. But the principles of cooling that their architects developed did not disappear. They filtered down into common architecture, were refined and adapted, and continued to influence Persian building design for centuries. You spend the afternoon exploring the palace ruins, trying to imagine what life would have been like here when the buildings were intact and the systems fully functioning. Cool water flowing underfoot, fresh breezes wafting through high-ceilinged chambers, gardens green and fragrant around every corner. servants bringing iced sharbat on silver trays. It would have been paradise, literally, that Persian word that means a walled garden, a refuge from the heat and chaos of the world outside. As the sun begins to set, you find a spot on a crumbling terrace overlooking what was once a royal garden. The channels are dry now, the fountains still, but you can see the outlines of where they were, the paths the water took, the patterns it made. And you can imagine, if you close your eyes, the sound of water splashing, the feel of cool air on your skin, the taste of sharbat on your tongue. The desert is still here, hot and dry and unforgiving. But within these walls, for those who knew the secrets, there was comfort. There was pleasure. There was cool. The next morning, Mahmoud tells you that it is time to visit a garden. Not just any garden, he clarifies, but one of the great Persian gardens that has survived from ancient times, a living example of how the Persians used vegetation and water to create cool microclimates in the middle of the desert. You set out early, while the air is still relatively cool, walking through the city and then through agricultural lands until you reach the garden's walls. The walls themselves are significant. They are tall, perhaps 3 meters, built from thick mud brick and extending around the entire perimeter of the garden. These walls serve multiple purposes. They define the space, separating the garden from the surrounding landscape. They provide security, protecting the valuable plants and water within. And they create a sheltered microclimate, blocking the hot winds that blow across the plateau and trapping the cool, moist air that the garden produces. You enter through a simple wooden gate and immediately feel the difference. It is like stepping into another world. The air is cooler by several degrees. It is also more humid, carrying the scent of flowers and green leaves. The sound has changed too. Outside, the desert was silent except for the wind. Here, you can hear water flowing, birds singing, leaves rustling. The change is so dramatic that you stop just inside the gate, letting your senses adjust. The garden is laid out in the classic Persian style, what is known as a chahar bag, meaning 4 gardens. The space is divided into quadrants by 2 perpendicular channels of water that meet at a central pavilion. Each quadrant is planted with fruit trees, flowering plants, and shade trees, arranged in geometric patterns that are both beautiful and functional. The channels are shallow but constantly flowing, fed by a qanat that emerges at the garden's highest point and carrying water to every corner. This layout is not arbitrary. It is based on deep understanding of how plants, water, and air interact in a hot climate. The trees provide shade, reducing the amount of solar radiation that reaches the ground. The shade keeps the soil cool, which keeps the air above it cool. The water channels provide evaporative cooling and also maintain the humidity that plants need to thrive. The walls block wind and trap the cool air that the garden produces, preventing it from mixing with the hot air outside. Walking through the garden, you can feel the layers of this cooling system working together. Closest to the water channels, where evaporation is most active, the air is coolest and most humid. Under the shade of large trees, it is cooler still. In the open areas where sunlight penetrates, it is warmer, but still much cooler than outside the walls. The pavilion at the center, positioned where all four quadrants meet, benefits from the combined cooling of the entire garden and catches any breeze that manages to penetrate the space. Scholars have studied Persian gardens extensively, and they have found that well-designed examples can maintain temperatures 10 to 15 degrees below ambient conditions. This is comparable to the cooling provided by a badger or a well-insulated building, but achieved entirely through vegetation and water. The gardens also provide food, producing fruit, nuts, and herbs that supplement the diet. And they provide beauty, spaces for relaxation and contemplation that were highly valued in Persian culture. The Persian word for garden is pardis, which is the origin of the English word paradise. This is not a coincidence. In Zoroastrian theology, paradise was conceived as a garden, a place of eternal spring where the righteous would spend the afterlife. The great gardens of Persia were attempts to create paradise on earth, to build little islands of perfection in a harsh and imperfect world. Cooling was part of this vision. Paradise, by definition, was a place where the oppressive heat of the desert could not reach. The plants in the garden are carefully chosen for their cooling effects. Tall trees like plane trees and poplars provide dense shade. Fruit trees like pomegranates and figs provide both shade and food. Flowering plants like roses and jasmine provide fragrance that enhances the sensory experience of coolness. And ground cover plants help to keep the soil moist and cool, preventing the heat absorption that bare ground would cause. One interesting detail that Mahmud points out is the positioning of aromatic plants near water features. As the water evaporates, it carries the scent of the nearby flowers with it, perfuming the air. This was a deliberate design choice, creating what some historians call an olfactory landscape, a garden that was experienced through smell as well as sight and touch. The combination of cool air and sweet fragrance was considered the height of sensory pleasure. The maintenance of a Persian garden was labor-intensive, but followed established patterns. Gardeners pruned trees to maintain proper shade coverage. They cleared channels to keep water flowing freely. They replaced plants that died and added new varieties to maintain diversity. The knowledge of how to maintain these gardens was passed down through generations, just like the knowledge of Karnat building and Yakchal management. You spend several hours in the garden, sitting in the shade, listening to the water, watching light filter through the leaves. It is easy to forget that outside these walls, the desert is baking under a merciless sun. In here, there is peace. There is cool. There is green. The birds that nest in the trees know nothing of the harsh climate beyond. For them, this little paradise is the whole world. As you prepare to leave, you notice a group of children playing near one of the water channels. They are splashing in the shallow water, laughing and shrieking, clearly delighted by the cold. Their parents sit nearby in the shade, watching with indulgent smiles. This scene, you realize, has been repeated in this garden for centuries. Generations of children have played in this water, have known this cool, have grown up in this little paradise. The garden is not just a piece of engineering. It is a piece of cultural memory, a place where the past is continuously present. The walk back to the city is hot and dusty, a reminder of what the garden has protected you from. But you carry something of it with you, the memory of cool air, the scent of roses, the sound of water. These memories, stored in your mind, are a kind of paradise too, a refuge you can return to whenever the world becomes too hot to bear. The technologies you have been learning about did not stay in Persia. They traveled, following the routes of trade and conquest, spreading outward from the Persian plateau to transform how people lived across a huge swath of the world. Tonight, as you sit in Mahmud's courtyard, listening to the badger breathe overhead, he tells you the story of how Persian cooling conquered the West. The first and most direct route was through conquest. When the Arab armies swept out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, they encountered Persian civilization and were immediately impressed by its sophistication. The Arabs conquered Persia militarily, but in many ways Persia conquered them culturally. Arab rulers adopted Persian administrative systems, Persian art, Persian poetry, and Persian cooling technology. Within a century, wind catchers and qanat-style irrigation were being built across the expanding Islamic world. The spread to Egypt happened quickly. Egypt had its own ancient traditions of cooling, but the sophisticated Persian systems were more effective. Soon, Malkaf, the Arabic name for wind catchers, were rising above Cairo and other Egyptian cities. The design was adapted to local conditions, with simpler structures that caught the prevailing north winds and directed them down into buildings. Some historians believe that earlier Egyptian wind scoops may have influenced the development of the Persian badgir, creating a kind of technological exchange that went in both directions. The spread to North Africa and Spain took longer, but had perhaps the most lasting impact. When the Moors conquered the Iberian Peninsula in the 8th century, they brought with them the accumulated knowledge of Persian and Arab cooling technology. The gardens of Alhambra in Granada, with their fountains and channels and carefully positioned plantings, are direct descendants of the Persian Chahar Bagh tradition. The underground cisterns of Andalusian cities show clear influence from Persian qanat design. Spain, in turn, became a bridge to the Americas. When the Spanish colonized the New World, they brought their building traditions with them, including the cooling techniques they had learned from the Moors. The central courtyards of colonial Latin American architecture, with their fountains and shaded arcades, trace their lineage back through Spain to Persia. The acequia irrigation systems of New Mexico and California are descended from Qanat technology, adapted for a new continent. But the spread was not only through conquest. Trade played an equally important role. The Silk Road, that great network of routes connecting east and west, carried not just goods but ideas. Merchants who traveled to Persian cities saw the wind towers and tasted the ice-cold sharbat and asked how such things were possible. They carried the answers back with them, and local builders tried to replicate what they had learned. Variations of Persian cooling technology appeared along the entire length of the Silk Road, from Central Asia to China. Scholars have traced specific design features to track how the technology spread. The octagonal wind tower, characteristic of Central Persia, appears in modified forms across the Middle East. The one-sided wind scoop, developed for areas with consistent prevailing winds, became dominant in Egypt and parts of India. The underground cooling chambers associated with Qanats were replicated wherever the Qanat technology was adopted. Each region adapted the basic principles to its specific climate and available materials, creating a family of related but distinct cooling traditions. One fascinating example of this spread is the Bauli, or stepwell, of India. These elaborate structures, which combine water storage with cooling function, show clear influence from Persian Qanat and Yakhchal technology. The Mughals, who conquered much of India in the 16th century, were direct cultural descendants of the Persians and brought Persian building traditions with them. The great Mughal gardens, like those of the Taj Mahal, are explicitly modelled on Persian prototypes. The spread to East Africa happened through maritime trade. Arab and Persian merchants had been sailing to the East African coast for centuries, establishing trading posts and mixing with local populations. They brought their building traditions with them, and variations of Persian cooling technology appeared in coastal cities from Somalia to Mozambique. The wind towers of places like Lamu in Kenya are distant cousins of the Badgers of Yazd. What is remarkable about this spread is how the basic principles remained consistent even as the specific implementations varied widely. Whether in Morocco or Uzbekistan or Kerala, the same fundamental understanding was at work. Use thermal mass to moderate temperature swings. Use evaporative cooling to reduce temperatures. Use natural ventilation to move air. Use shade to reduce solar heat gain. These principles, first developed on the Persian plateau, became the foundation of vernacular architecture across much of the Old World. Modern scholars studying this spread have used it to understand how technology transfers between cultures. The Persian cooling technologies spread for several reasons. They worked, providing tangible benefits to anyone who adopted them. They could be adapted to local conditions without losing their effectiveness. They used locally available materials and skills, and they did not require centralized control or specialized industrial capacity. These characteristics made them what we might today call appropriate technology, solutions that could be implemented by communities without outside assistance. The irony, of course, is that much of this accumulated wisdom was lost or abandoned in the 20th century as mechanical air conditioning became available. Buildings that had been designed to work with the climate were retrofitted with compressors and ducts. New buildings were designed without any consideration of passive cooling, relying entirely on machines. The result has been an enormous increase in energy consumption and a corresponding increase in carbon emissions. But there are signs of change. Architects and engineers are rediscovering the principles of passive cooling and applying them to modern buildings. In Dubai, new towers incorporate wind catcher principles to reduce air conditioning loads. In India, stepwells are being restored and used as models for new public cooling spaces. In California, developers are building houses with thermal mass and natural ventilation, reducing energy use by half or more. The ancient wisdom of Persia, having traveled around the world and been largely forgotten, is finding its way home again. Your journey through ancient Persian cooling technology has reached a curious point. You have learned about systems that were developed thousands of years ago in a world without electricity or fossil fuels or climate-controlled laboratories. And yet, Mahmoud tells you, some of the most advanced engineering programs in the world are now studying these systems intensively, trying to understand their principles and apply them to modern challenges. Tomorrow, he says, you will meet someone who can explain why. The someone turns out to be a woman named Layla, a professor of sustainable architecture who divides her time between universities in Tehran and Vienna. She has published extensively on passive cooling systems and has consulted on projects that incorporate traditional Persian techniques into contemporary buildings. Farhad, the scholar you met earlier, introduced you to her by email, and she has agreed to meet you at a recently completed building that uses some of these principles. The building is a research center on the outskirts of the city, a modern structure that looks strikingly different from the traditional architecture you have been studying. It is made of concrete and glass, with clean lines and geometric forms. But Layla points out features that reveal its debt to Persian tradition. The orientation is carefully calculated to minimize solar gain. The walls incorporate massive thermal elements that absorb heat during the day and release it at night. And rising from the roof, unmistakably, is a wind tower, its form modernized, but its function unchanged. Layla explains why engineers are interested in these old technologies. The fundamental challenge, she says, is that the world is getting hotter just as it is becoming clearer that we cannot continue to rely on energy-intensive air conditioning. The electricity to run air conditioners comes primarily from fossil fuels, which contribute to climate change, which makes the world hotter, which increases demand for air conditioning. It is a vicious cycle that threatens to spin out of control. Passive cooling offers a way out of this cycle. Buildings designed using these principles can maintain comfortable temperatures with little or no mechanical cooling, reducing energy demand dramatically. And unlike air conditioners, which reject heat to the outside air and thereby warm the surrounding environment. Passive cooling systems either store heat for later release or dissipate it in ways that do not increase local temperatures. Layla shows you around the building, pointing out specific features and explaining how they work. The wind tower on the roof is connected to an underground chamber where canal water flows, recreating the classic Persian combination of wind-driven ventilation and evaporative cooling. But the system has been enhanced with computer-controlled dampers that can adjust airflow in response to changing conditions. Sensors throughout the building monitor temperature, humidity, and air quality, feeding data to a control system that optimizes the passive system's performance. This hybrid approach, combining ancient principles with modern technology, is what Layla calls neo-vernacular design. The basic physics have not changed in thousands of years. Hot air still rises. Water still evaporates. Thermal mass still stores and releases heat. What has changed is our ability to model these effects precisely, to optimize designs before they are built, and to use smart controls to squeeze maximum performance from passive systems. Scholars have measured the performance of buildings like this one and found that they can achieve comfort levels comparable to conventional air-conditioned buildings while using 70 to 90% less energy for cooling. In a world where buildings account for roughly 40% of energy use, and cooling is a growing share of that, the potential impact is enormous. If these techniques were applied widely, they could significantly reduce global carbon emissions while also making buildings more resilient to power outages and energy price spikes. But there are challenges, Layla admits. Modern buildings have requirements that ancient buildings did not. They contain electronics that generate heat and are sensitive to humidity. They have large glazed areas that emit solar radiation. They must meet strict codes for ventilation and air quality. Adapting traditional techniques to meet these requirements requires careful engineering and often involves trade-offs between energy efficiency and other goals. There are also cultural challenges. People have become accustomed to the precise, consistent conditions that mechanical air conditioning provides. They expect to be able to set a thermostat to exactly 22 degrees and have the building maintain that temperature regardless of conditions outside. Passive systems cannot match this level of control. They provide comfort within a range of conditions, not at a specific set point. Convincing building occupants to accept this variation requires education and cultural change. One interesting area of current research is what Layla calls bioclimatic architecture, the idea of designing buildings that work with natural processes rather than fighting against them. This goes beyond simply adding passive cooling features to conventional buildings. It involves fundamentally rethinking how buildings relate to their environments, taking cues from traditional architectures that evolved over centuries to work with local climates. The Persian architectural tradition is a particularly rich source of ideas for this approach because it developed in such an extreme climate. Solutions that work in the desert, where temperature swings of 30 degrees in a day are common, are likely to work almost anywhere. And the sophistication of Persian techniques, refined over millennia of experimentation, means there is much to learn, even from relatively simple traditional buildings. Layla takes you up to the roof to see the wind tower up close. It is taller than you expected, perhaps 8 meters, and built from materials that look traditional but are actually high-tech composites designed for durability and performance. The openings have adjustable louvers controlled by electric motors. Inside the shaft, you can see the internal partitions that divide airflow into separate channels, just like in the ancient badgers, but here made from precisely engineered materials with optimal thermal properties. As you stand beside the tower, feeling the gentle breeze it generates, Layla makes a philosophical point. We think of technology as progress, she says, as a movement from simple to complex, from primitive to advanced. But cooling technology does not fit this narrative. The most advanced cooling systems of the ancient world were in some ways more sophisticated than what we use today, more efficient, more sustainable, more in harmony with the natural world. Our challenge now is not to return to the past, but to learn from it, to take the wisdom that developed over millennia and apply it with the tools we have today. Your time in Persia is drawing to a close, and your head is full of new knowledge. You have learned about wind towers and qanats, yakchuls and gardens, syrup cellars and royal palaces. You have met scholars and craftspeople, professors and tea house owners. You have felt the cool air of ancient buildings and tasted the cold sweetness of sharbat on a hot afternoon. But as you walk through the modern parts of the city, you are struck by how much has been lost. The apartment buildings that line the main roads are made of concrete block, their walls thin and poorly insulated. They have small windows facing in arbitrary directions, without regard for sun angles or prevailing winds. There are no wind towers, no courtyards, no thermal mass to moderate temperature swings. Instead, every unit has one or more air conditioning boxes bolted to the walls, their compressors humming and dripping, rejecting heat into the already hot street. Mahmoud notices what you are looking at and sighs. These buildings, he says, were built quickly and cheaply during the oil boom, when energy was abundant and nobody thought about efficiency. They are terrible to live in, hot in summer and cold in winter, but they were all that many families could afford. The traditional houses in the old city, the ones with the badgers and the thick walls, are now expensive, gentrified, out of reach for ordinary people. This is one of the tragedies of the 20th century, repeated in country after country. As modern construction techniques became available, traditional building knowledge was abandoned. Architects trained in Western methods built Western-style buildings, regardless of local climate. Engineers specified mechanical systems to solve problems that traditional designs had solved passively. The result was buildings that worked only as long as electricity was cheap and available, and that became unbearable when power failed or fuel prices rose. The loss was not just practical but cultural. The craftspeople who knew how to build and maintain traditional cooling systems had fewer and fewer clients. Skills that had been passed down for generations were not passed to the next generation. Young people left villages for cities, where they worked in factories and offices rather than learning the trades of their parents. Within a few decades, centuries of accumulated knowledge was reduced to what could be found in a few academic papers, and the memories of elderly practitioners is less than has hone. To hash is greater than. Scholars who study this phenomenon have a name for it: technological lock-in. Once a society commits to a particular technological path, it becomes increasingly difficult to change course. Infrastructure is built around the dominant technology. Education systems train people to use it. Economic systems depend on it. Alternative approaches are marginalized or forgotten. Even when the dominant technology has obvious problems, switching to something else becomes increasingly difficult because so much is invested in the current system. Air conditioning is a perfect example of this lock-in. Once buildings began to be designed with the assumption that mechanical cooling would be available, their passive cooling features could be eliminated. This made buildings cheaper to construct, but more expensive to operate. It also made them dependent on continuous energy supply, vulnerable to blackouts and price spikes. By now, billions of people live and work in buildings that are essentially uninhabitable without mechanical cooling. The consequences of this dependence are becoming increasingly clear. Heat waves, intensified by climate change, are killing people in cities that lack adequate cooling. Power grids are strained to breaking point on hot summer afternoons when everyone runs their air conditioners at once. The electricity to run all those air conditioners comes primarily from burning fossil fuels, which releases carbon dioxide, which warms the planet, which increases the need for cooling. It is a trap of our own making. But there are reasons for hope. The rediscovery of traditional cooling techniques, which you witnessed in Layla's research center, is part of a broader movement to rethink how we build and live. Architects around the world are studying vernacular buildings, trying to understand how traditional societies adapted to their climates. Engineers are developing new materials and systems that incorporate passive cooling principles. Urban planners are redesigning cities to include more vegetation, more water features, more shade. In Iran itself, there is growing interest in preserving and reviving traditional cooling technologies. The government has designated some historic badgurs and qanats as protected cultural heritage. Universities are training new generations of experts in traditional techniques. Wealthy homeowners are restoring old buildings or commissioning new ones that incorporate traditional features. It is a small movement, still overshadowed by the continued construction of conventional buildings, but it is growing. Mahmoud tells you about a project he has been involved with, restoring a historic caravanserai, an ancient roadside inn for travelers. The building had fallen into ruin, its badgers collapsed, its qanat blocked. But a foundation has been working to restore it, using traditional techniques as much as possible, training young craftspeople in the old skills. When it reopens, it will function both as a hotel and as a demonstration of what traditional buildings can do. The restoration has not been easy. Finding craftspeople who knew the old techniques was difficult. Getting permits from authorities unfamiliar with traditional construction methods was bureaucratically challenging. Sourcing traditional materials in a market dominated by modern products required patience and connections. But slowly, the building is coming back to life. The badgers have been rebuilt. The canal has been cleared and is flowing again. The thick walls have been replastered with traditional materials. What matters most, Mahmoud says, is not the building itself, but what it represents, proof that another way is possible. People who stay there will experience passive cooling firsthand. They will feel the difference between a building that works with the climate and one that fights against it. Some of them will go home and demand better from their own buildings. Some of them will become architects or engineers and design buildings that incorporate what they learned. The knowledge that was nearly lost will spread again, one person at a time. You think about this as you walk back toward the old city, past the humming air conditioners and the thin walls and the buildings that would be ovens without electricity. The wisdom is not gone. It is just waiting to be remembered. It is your last night in the city, and Mahmoud has arranged something special. You are going to sleep on a rooftop, the traditional way, under the stars, cooled by the night air and the breathing of the badger. It is, he says, the best way to understand what all of this technology was really for, not just survival, but comfort. Not just comfort, but pleasure. Not just pleasure, but peace. The rooftop belongs to a traditional house in the old city, one of the few that still functions as a home rather than a museum or a boutique hotel. The family who lives there has been there for 7 generations, and they maintain the building the old way, with annual repairs to the badger and regular clearing of the Kanat connection. The house is cool and comfortable, even in the worst heat of summer, they tell you, as it has been for centuries. You climb the narrow stairs as the sun is setting, carrying a thin mattress and a pillow. The rooftop is broad and flat, surrounded by low walls that provide privacy without blocking the breeze. Other families in the neighborhood are doing the same thing, preparing their rooftop sleeping areas for the night. You can hear conversations and laughter from nearby roofs, the sounds of a community preparing for rest. The view is remarkable. From up here, you can see the entire old city spread out before you, a jumble of domes and walls, and, rising above them all, the forest of badgers. They are silhouetted against the evening sky, tall and dignified, like guardians watching over the sleeping city. In the distance, you can see the modern high-rises, their windows glowing with artificial light, their air conditioners humming. But here, in the old city, the only light comes from oil lamps and candles, and the only sound is the wind. You spread your mattress and lie down, looking up at the sky. The first stars are appearing, faint at first, then brighter as the darkness deepens. The Milky Way stretches across the heavens, a river of light that has flowed here every night for all of human history. People have been lying on rooftops like this, looking at stars like these for thousands of years. The technology has changed, but the experience is the same. The air is cool now, cooler than you expected. The heat of the day is dissipating rapidly, radiating up into the clear sky, the same radiative cooling that made the yakshals possible. You pull a light blanket over yourself, enjoying the sensation of needing a blanket after a day of sweating. The badger of the house you are staying in rises nearby, and you can hear it breathing, a soft whisper of air moving through its channels. Mahmoud comes up to check on you, bringing a small glass of sharbat, cold and sweet. He sits beside you for a while, pointing out the constellations that the Persians used to navigate by, telling you the stories they told about the stars. There is a sense of continuity here, of being connected to all the generations who came before, who lay on rooftops just like this, and looked at skies just like this, and told stories just like these. He tells you about the concept of tarof, the elaborate system of courtesy and deference that governs Persian social interaction. Offering you this place to sleep, he explains, is a form of tarof, a way of showing respect and creating obligation. By accepting, you become part of a web of relationships that extends backward in time and forward into the future. You are not just a visitor, but a guest, with all the rights and responsibilities that implies. The stars continue to emerge. The rooftops around you grow quiet as families settle in for the night. Somewhere, a baby cries briefly and is soothed. Somewhere else, a couple murmurs to each other, their words too soft to make out. The city is falling asleep, house by house, roof by roof, person by person. You think about everything you have learned. The badgers that catch the wind, the qanats that carry water for miles, the yakshals that make ice in the desert, the gardens that create paradise on earth, the sharbat that tastes like summer and relief and hospitality. All of this technology, developed over millennia, refined through countless experiments, passed down through generations, all of it ultimately serving this simple purpose, making it possible to live and live well in a place that should have been uninhabitable. The Persians did not just adapt to the desert, they thrived in it. They built an empire. They created poetry and mathematics and philosophy. They developed art and architecture that influenced the entire world. And they did all of this while staying cool, while sipping cold drinks in hot afternoons, while sleeping under the stars on summer nights. They solved a problem that we, with all our technology and energy, are still struggling to solve sustainably. The night grows deeper. The stars grow brighter. The air grows cooler still. You pull the blanket closer and feel your breathing slow, your muscles relax, your thoughts begin to drift. The badger sighs softly. The city sleeps around you. The ancient technology does what it has always done, quietly, patiently, without fuss or fanfare. Your eyes close. Your last thought before sleep is of water, cold water from a glacier, flowing through dark tunnels, arriving here after miles and years, cooling the air you breathe, making possible this moment of peace. The water does not know or care about empires or technologies or the passage of time. It just flows as it has always flowed, as it will always flow, cold and clean and life-giving. You sleep. The stars wheel overhead. The night passes. Tomorrow will bring heat again, but that is tomorrow. Tonight there is only this: the cool air, the soft breeze, the ancient city, the timeless stars. Tonight there is peace. Closing. And so the night settles over you like a soft, cool blanket, and the stories you have heard begin to blend with dreams. You are walking through underground tunnels where water flows forever. You are standing in a garden where roses bloom in impossible colors. You are sitting in a tea house where the sharbat is always cold and the conversation never ends. The badger breathes above you, slow and steady, a rhythm older than memory. The courtyards flow beneath you, patient as time itself. Somewhere in the distance, a yakhchal holds its ice, cold and quiet, waiting for summer mornings that have not yet arrived. The city sleeps, and you sleep with it, held in the embrace of technologies so elegant that they feel like nature itself. Let your thoughts drift now, like clouds across a desert sky. Let your breathing slow, like water finding its level. Let your body rest, cool and comfortable, supported by the wisdom of centuries. There is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to remember. The ancient engineers have done their work. The builders have built. The water flows. The wind sighs. And you, traveler, have earned your rest. The stars continue their ancient dance overhead, indifferent to empires, outlasting all technologies. But down here, in this little corner of the world, something remarkable happened. People learned to live where life should not have been possible. They learned to be cool when the world was hot. They learned to be comfortable when comfort should have been impossible. And they passed that learning down, generation to generation, until it reached you, tonight, in this moment of peace. Sleep now. The desert night is cool and kind. The morning will come when it comes. Until then, rest. Dream of gardens. Dream of water. Dream of wind moving through ancient towers, bringing coolness to all who need it. Dream of ice in summer, of cold drinks on hot days, of shade in the noonday sun. dream of wisdom that took thousands of years to accumulate, and that waits, patient as stone, for anyone willing to learn. Good night, traveler. The Persian night holds you gently. Sleep well,